Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update extra video giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where are we going to start today? Well, actually, I'm going to dip into a couple of comments that have been made. You commenters are amazing. I've got quite a backlog of ones I really want to deal with. These are a couple from a few days ago, and actually, they're going to bring up a video I made last October, and you can go and watch that. I'll give it a link in the description if I remember. So what is the comment? This is Ian Lyle says, Jonathan, could you please tell me or us how Ukraine hits targets with accuracy? Are they using GPS or what? I tried to research but found my brain was hurting too much. I'm not going to directly answer that question. I'm going to use that as an excuse to go over some old ground. Now, what I did in October is, as part of one of my extras, I dealt with the old maps theory and I delved into satellites. And there was a whole section in here where I did that. And I was trying to justify my claims that Russia are using old maps and that they are using very bad satellite imagery. And part of the old maps part was giving evidence of old maps being used. Literally, when they attacked into, when they initially invaded in February of 2022, invaded Ukraine, the Russian troops were found to have outdated maps. I mean, they literally had them on them in their APCs and whatever, showing places that weren't there. And so the question back in October I was trying to answer is, why do they keep hitting residential targets? I was saying, look, it seems a bit ridiculous that even like the Russian military, who you can give whatever criticism to, but surely with a depleted stockpile of missiles, they're not going to be sending missiles willy nilly at civilian targets. Yes, there is a break their hearts and minds, but this at this stage in a war, that ain't going to happen. They know that. So my theory has been that they don't intentionally go for civilian targets. What they do is they intentionally go for military targets, but two things happen. One, the circle error probable is pretty horrendous. So they end up more often than not hitting residential targets. And when they do hit military targets, you don't hear about that because the Ukrainians won't let you know. But they very often hit residential targets because they use things like S300s. And S300s in a ground to ground mode have circle error probable of, I don't know what it is because actually it hasn't really been tested in ground to ground, but it's going to be probably in the area of like 500 meters or something like that, which means that 50% of the rockets or the missiles they send, in order for these to be called precision missiles, 50% of them have to hit within 500 meters, which means that almost 100% of them cannot hit the target and it's still a precision guided munition. And so therefore, like 50% of them are hitting within 500 meters. So say they're hitting, I don't know, a dormitory or like a high, where they think HIMARS are being stored in a garage or something like that. They send 10 missiles, right, over a couple of weeks, and 5 of them hit within 500 meters but don't hit that thing, so they're just scattered anywhere within. Well, actually, is that 500 meters from the center? So over the weeks, that you can imagine that being a 1 kilometer like entire diameter uh, of around that target, and then 50% of them don't even have to go anywhere near that. So you could have the situation where that HIMARS garage, no rockets have hit that. They've all therefore hit just random things, and the Russians can still technically call that a precision guided missile. So that's a circle error probable. So that's happening. They're not using accurate enough missiles. And then the second thing that's happening is they're using outdated maps. And some people called that into question when I said last time. And they said, well, look, here, and I showed a bunch of evidence, like they found maps on them in several places at several times, and they're still finding old maps. I in one of my videos, only kind of a month or two ago, I think there was another old map being found. But also, I showed some evidence in this video that someone was saying that it seems really odd. I live here, or I live around here. My dad lives here, and he's noted that all the places they've hit used to be bases 25 years ago, but they're not military bases anymore. And he was saying that I think they're using really old maps because there is a kind of sense to what they're doing, but it's just really, really out of date. And so, and there are all these other bits of jigsaw to add to the picture that yeah, they are using old maps, and that's partly why they are being inaccurate with their missile attacks. But the other component of what I talked about was the satellite imagery, right? And the satellite imagery that the Russians have access to compared to the satellite imagery that the Ukrainians have access to. And I referred to a couple of articles that I'm going to re-refer to today, go through it again, and also refer to a slightly newer article, but it's basically the same kind of data. So the idea is that the Russians do not have good satellite imagery uh, to quite a significant degree. And you might think, oh, I can use Google Maps or Google Maps Pro or whatever. And it's like, well, the Russians really are struggling to get decent resolution imagery that is current for their needs. So we're going to go through that in a little bit of detail. So this newer article, which is only from March this year, March the 29th, end of March, is by Michael Peck here on Popular Mechanics. Says why Russian space satellites are failing in the Ukraine war. He said during the Cold War, Russia became the first nation to launch a satellite and then a human being into outer space. With more than 160 Russian satellites in orbit today, every Ukrainian city, tank, and howitzer should be exposed to the unrelenting gaze of orbital cameras. But that's not happening on the battlefield. While Ukraine's military is reaping enormous benefits from commercial communications and photographic satellites, Russia is only getting meager rewards from its huge investment in military spacecraft, according to a Western expert. Quote, the Ukrainian army can use commercial systems to obtain images of any area in high detail at least twice a day in favorable weather conditions, whereas a Russian army can get an image of the same area approximately once in 2 weeks. Twice a day, Ukrainians, once in 2 weeks, Russians. Can you hit a HIMARS that is shooting and scooting? And even if it's parked back in a garage and you know where it is, can you still hit it if you're getting that information once every 2 weeks? So that is a huge difference. Pavel Luzin, who is a guy that's written these other articles, a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, wrote in a recent article for Riddle, in addition, quote, existing Russian satellites provide seriously inferior quality of imagery vis-a-vis American and European commercial satellites. It's not even talking about military satellites. So it goes on to say what Russia does lack is the right mix of satellites. So it's got a bunch of satellites up there, but that's not great. So what Russia does lack is a right mix of satellites, as well as the ground systems and procedures to receive and disseminate data to those who need it. So you've got issues. You've got the wrong types of satellite, or they're out of date, or they're not very good. And even when you get that information, you've not got the systems and procedures. So not only the actual like hardware systems to sort out that data, but then the procedures, like the people and the structures and the organization to get that information to the front lines in a suitable manner. For example, the Liana spacecraft are designed to track ships, but Russia has always been a land rather than naval power, and being able to track US aircraft carriers in the Pacific doesn't help win a ground war in Ukraine. Realizing that it was falling behind in the new space race, Russia opted in the early 2000s not to build spy satellites. Quote, the Kremlin decided to start with a satellite navigation system, GLONASS, and communication satellites that rely on Western electronic components, Luzin said. The reconnaissance satellites were much harder a task for the Russian space industry, and it turned to this task just in the early 2010s. But the imposition of Western sanctions after 2014 annexation of Crimea hampered investment in reconnaissance systems. The result is that Russia has just 2 optical intelligence photographic satellites in orbit now. 2 new reserve satellites have been delayed until at least 2024, while 3 Russian commercial satellites, which could be used for military imagery, may no longer be functional. While the exact number of US spy satellites is classified, the National Reconnaissance Office planned at least 7 launches in 2022. The agency is now contracting with commercial companies for hyperspectral satellite imagery that can detect objects through multiple bands of light. It isn't just satellites that are the problem. Troops lack satellite communications terminals, which only exacerbates the Russian military's rigid and compartmentalized command system. While the GLONASS GPS satellites work, users lack terminals and electronic maps to utilize satellite navigation. And I'm going to then go on to another piece, just quickly, Satellites of Stagnation by Pavel Luzin, who's a guy that was referenced there. This is from March 2023. And he says, just a few paragraphs in this one. At the same time, Russia is going to great lengths to reserve the GLONASS system. So this is their own kind of system. In 2022, two new generation GLONASS K navigation satellites were launched into orbit, and the last spare GLONASS M satellite from the previous generation was also launched. Meanwhile, 3 satellites were removed from the system in the same year. All in all, 14 out of 25 satellites are out of date, sometimes serving more than twice their useful life. And this number will only grow in the next few years. According to the officially declared plans, up to 15 GLONASS K satellites were to be launched during 2022 to 30, but this will not replace all the retired satellites anyway. Furthermore, it is not certain whether the architecture of the entire GLONASS system can actually be changed thanks to the addition of high-orbit satellites for the sake of navigation in and around Russia using a smaller number of such devices. Similarly unclear are the prospects of a possible transition of GLONASS to small, low-orbit navigation satellites modelled on China's Beidou, which would make the system cheaper. 1 year of war has also shown that the Russian army has serious problems with space communications, despite 47 military satellites, formerly 52 in March 2020, and the possibility to use the state civilian satellite systems GONETS and Express, as well as Gazprom's satellite communication system. The main reason underlying these problems is not clear. Possibly this is due to the low quality and poor condition of most military satellites, except for the 4 Blagovest satellites which have been built with European components. There is also more certainty that there are problems with the ground equipment, as well as errors in the architecture of the communications and control system of the Russian troops. Okay, so now to go back to the original pieces I looked at back in October, and these were from May, is it May last year, if I remember? April, this one's from April last year. So this is Radio Free Europe's excellent article. In Russia's war on Ukraine, effective satellites are few and far between. And it relies on Pavel Luzin again, I think, later here. But anyway, let's dip into that. But in any case, a proliferation of Western technological developments has resulted in an explosion of high-quality, real-time satellite imagery available not only to military intelligence, but also private commercial companies. Russia has virtually none of that. Quote, in principle, Russia is already practically blind in orbit, said Bart Hendricks, a Brussels-based analyst and expert on Soviet and Russian space programs. I mean, that's so important. If Russia are almost practically blind in space and Ukraine are getting the access to the very best intelligence and information systems, you have got a gap in capability there. That is absolutely fundamental to successful acquisition and acquisition, targeting, and carrying out of any kind of military activity, but also of communicating between troops, of all the extra things around the side that things like Starlink enable. According to a database maintained by the Union of Concerned Scientists, a respected US non-governmental organization, Russia currently has around 100 military or dual-purpose satellites. 19 of them are classified as remote sensing satellites, with technology allowing either optical photography or radio signal surveillance. The others serve other purposes. So really, there's only 19 satellites is the idea here that are of any use. Russia has 2 optical reconnaissance satellites in orbit now, called Persona, Hendricks said, but they were launched between 7 and 9 years ago, meaning they may be near the end of their working life. Adding further to the problem, the maximum resolution of the Persona satellites is believed to be 50 centimeters per pixel. So 1 pixel is giving you something like that. By comparison, the best American spy satellites, called Keyhole, are estimated to have a resolution of around 5 centimeters per pixel. At that resolution, the letter V, which is being painted on the roofs of Russian military vehicles operating in Ukraine, would be easily and clearly visible from the typical altitude where a spy satellite was orbiting. In other words, like those kind of Vs and Zs and whatever painted on top of vehicles with the Russian satellites, it's unlikely that you'd be able to clearly make them out. You know, if you're thinking that is 1 pixel of an image, then you could be in greater trouble than, that is 1 pixel. You'll be able to make out detail obviously a lot better with the American systems and European and the ones that Ukraine will be able to access. Commercial satellite companies like Maxar and Planet typically have a maximum resolution of around 15 centimeters. The Americans, quote, the Americans have at least 5 keyhole 12 satellites. The Italians, the French, and the Spaniards have their own satellites. There are an order of magnitude more, Hendricks told RFE. Russia has also lagged behind in building and deploying remote sensing satellites whose radars can see through cloud cover, unlike optical satellites. So optical satellites are just looking down to see what you see, and if there's cloud above, so when it's been raining and over the winter and springtime, you're going to have more cloud cover, which means you can't see jack. So it doesn't matter what your resolution is, you ain't seeing through a cloud. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists database, Russia has only one confirmed radar satellite in operation called Condor. It was launched in 2014 with an expected lifespan of 5 years. So it's already 4 years past its sell-by date. It may have already ceased to be operational. In terms of radar satellites, Russia also lags behind NATO by an order of magnitude, he said. Just the gap of capability is phenomenal. The world's most dominant system for positioning technology is the US-built platform known simply as Global Positioning System, or GPS. The technology is publicly available and widely used in everything from navigation systems to handheld smartphones. But because it's owned and operated by the US government, Russia has long chafed at the system and sought to build an alternative known as GLONASS. But for the GLONASS network to be fully functional, it needs 24 satellites. So this is a positioning system. Russia currently has 23 deployed, and several of them are nearing the end of their lifespan in orbit. Experts said up to 90% of the electronics which need to be resistant to space radiation that can quickly destroy sensitive equipment used in the next generation GLONASS K1 satellites are imported. Russia has tried to design and manufacture homegrown replacement parts, but the result was a satellite that was twice as heavy as the previous models, and it has yet to be launched into orbit. Quote, half of the GLONASS satellites can fall out of orbit at any moment. In principle, the failure of the first 3 or 4 will only affect the accuracy in a certain area, but for normal coverage of the territory of Russia, about 18 units are needed, said one expert who worked in Russian and European aerospace industry and asked to remain anonymous to discuss sensitive industry matters. Another problem is data processing. According to Pavel Podvig, an expert in Russian armed forces and a senior fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research in Geneva, it's one thing to have satellites, it's another thing to be able to use them. You need a system that will allow you to quickly transfer information from satellites to the right people who will process it and transfer it to the people responsible, for example, for target designation. The fact that Russia has some satellites still flying does not mean that such a system exists, and if it exists, in the case of Russia, it is difficult to say how good or bad it is. So things are just looking bad. And then that piece refers to this paper as well. Again, Pavel Luzin here, his paper in the Jamestown Foundation, Russia's space satellite problems and the war in Ukraine. Basically goes into a load more detail and sort of references a load of the claims that these articles have been sort of using. I just want to again dip into it, but towards the end, just to kind of add some meat to those bones. Considering the facts that the number of the Russian troops engaged in 2022 re-invasion of Ukraine, and bear in mind this was back in May last year. Yeah, May last year. Re-invasion of Ukraine may have reached as high as 190,000, and these troops attacked from 5 different directions. Russian satellite communication capacity certainly would not have been high enough to support effective warfare. In other words, with the Russians operating on 5 different areas of Ukraine, the Russian satellite system can't deal with that. They can't help those Russian troops. Maybe in one particular area, but across the whole of that, the whole of Ukraine, it's going to struggle, that satellite system and all the processes and procedures. Moreover, the speed of a typical Russian ground-based satellite communication terminal is 34 to 4096 kilobits per second in the Ku band and 32 to 1024 kbits per second in the C band. So even, I mean, I don't understand that, but you get the idea. Well, you will. So even if Russia possessed more satellites and each Russian battalion tactical group operated a dedicated satellite communication terminal, which isn't necessarily the case, right? The total Russian satellite communication bandwidth would be several times higher than the US and its allies had. Oh, really? During Operation Desert Storm in 1991. So even if everything was operating really well, they'd just be doing a little bit better than the Americans in 1991, but several times lower than the US and its allies used during Operation Iraqi Freedom over a decade later. So right now, the Russians are going to be operating worse than Gulf 2. Just incredible. Finally, Russian military communications are organized as a vertically oriented hierarchy with the National Defense Operations Center at the top, rather than a true network-centric system. This setup, common to many dictatorial countries, further undermines Russia's already insufficient satellite communication system, reducing its battlefield utility. Thus, the highly centralized political system President Putin is trying to preserve plays its own role in reducing the usability of Russian military satellites. And this plays into what we have heard on intercepts and from a bunch of different sources where Russian troops have themselves said that we can't get counter battery fire or artillery support is not accurate. It's hitting us at friendly fire, but they talk about often the communication. We can't get through. They can't fire it in time. It takes too long. There's this. They're keeping the information there. Blah 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 blah. This basically those last few claims have actually been borne out by a whole bunch of data that we've had over the course of this war. So it's interesting that back in May he is making those claims, and those claims for the last 10 months have been for sure what we have seen. So when the question is, well, how do the Ukrainians, how come there's so much more action? So this goes back to some of the Russian voice claims in my threads and that you see elsewhere, which is like, oh, you Russians use 5 times more artillery shells per day than the Ukrainians, and you're telling me that the Ukrainians are killing more than the Russians, and you also say that the artillery is the biggest killer. Yeah, because the Russians don't have any ability to accurately target in the same way that Ukrainians do. Like, there's such a gap. There's such a fundamental gap there. It's a gaping chasm between what these two forces have in terms of that ability to target acquire, to be accurate, and to have it in a timely fashion. A really current, real-time intelligence. The Ukrainians have that. The Russians don't. They have poor resolution. So therefore, it's relying on drones to spot things optically from operations on the ground. And if you're not also using precision munitions that the Russians aren't, so the Ukrainians have been using a lot of Excalibur shells, and we've seen that. We've seen video footage, drone footage of a single shot taking out a single piece of equipment. One shot, kill, done, job done. Whereas we've also seen, and I've seen this with the Ukrainians as well, with mortar fire being walked in and having. So we saw that drone footage of that big battle that took place, and there was like 20 bits of mortar, but that was mortar, and that's what you're going to expect. When you're walking artillery in, it's inaccurate, and you have to walk it in and change things, and you're using 20 odd shells to eventually hit with one shell sometimes, and so if your army is relying on that all the time, as the Russians might well be, then you don't have precision because you don't have precision guided munitions, then you are going to have incredibly inefficient weapons, and that is why the Russians can fire a whole load more shells than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians fire far fewer, and the Ukrainians are killing more people than the Russians. And you put that together with then HIMARS and MLRS, but with better targeting, so on and so forth. If you're having this satellite imagery, if you're winning the information game, then it's going to transfer through to a difference in ratio. That difference in the ratio of how many the Ukrainians can kill with how many the Russians can. So anyway, I thank you for that comment. It's reminding me that I needed to remind you guys on that, and as well as myself. Right, possibly a little bit of philosophy here, Jonathan. Here is a challenge for you, well within your wonderful abilities. Well, thank you. I don't know that they are. So why, when we are witnessing an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign state, are we reticent in allowing morally retaliation on the attacking state? I.e., why of the USA, etc. Why are they prohibiting Ukraine from hitting back in Russia? Tonight we saw a drone hit the Kremlin. Maybe if Ukraine were openly allowed to hit Russian military targets in Russia, this could be done and dusted sooner. Discuss. Absolutely great point. This is to do with politics, really. This is about the US and other nations walking a really fine line where they don't want to escalate, and this is where you get the Germans the other day saying, we'll provide you with Gepard ammunition, but we don't want this ammunition or German munitions being used inside the Russian border, and that's because they want to help, but they don't want to push it too far. But you'll find that, as with people, draw these red lines because they're still afraid of Russia. So there's a difference between what's morally right and what's kind of realpolitik, what's practically in the best interests of the people making these decisions. So the US, like from a purely moral position, there is no. I mean, from a purely moral position, Ukraine should be able to invade Russia, I suppose. Look, you've invaded me. If we want to win this war and get you out, then we should be able to, retaliate back to you in lots of different ways. And you could build up a case for some kind of retaliation inside Russian borders if it was led to an expedient kind of repulsion of the Russian forces from Ukraine, etc., etc. So you can build up a case for that. But if you then starting to use uh, if you're starting to think about, well, actually, what would the ramifications of this action be, then you shouldn't do this. It's kind of like use of moral consequentialism. So in philosophy, moral consequentialism is the morality of something is defined by the outcome that it obtains, right? So, but it's all really difficult because actually it gets really thoroughly nuanced. There's so much, goodness me, do I go down a rabbit hole here? I'm a moral skeptic, right? So I don't believe morality exists outside of our heads, okay? Out there, there's no kind of moral laws out there. If we all died, there wouldn't be like morality floating around the ether. So where is morality? Well, it's in the actions we do, and it's in how we ascribe intentions and value to those actions. But I would have a different moral value system to the next person along. So who's right? Well, arguably, you can say no one's right because it doesn't exist out there. What we have to do is construct it ourselves and then argue for it using rationality. Which is why politically, which is morality, politics is just morality writ large across society. Right? It's why half of you, I argue, politely, hopefully, normally, with half of you say, yeah, I really like the videos you do, but I do disagree with your politics and you're wrong, blah blah blah. So what that is saying is like your morality is wrong, essentially, and I would say the same thing back to them. Well, your morality is wrong, actually, which is your politics is wrong, and then we say, okay, well, why is it wrong? Well, it's wrong because of X, Y, and Z. So, and it depends what you're putting into these function machines as to what you get out. It depends how much you're using intuition. It depends how much you're using psychology, is like empathizing with other people. All these things go into the mix of how you construct your moral value system. And I don't want to get in further into the weeds there, but suffice to say that this is why we argue online all the time about what's right and wrong. It's because there is no right and wrong that exists out there. Okay, and that is evidenced by the fact that moral philosophy for the last 3,000 years still hasn't given us a moral value system that is perfect, that works, because there is no moral value system that works, whether you believe in a religious moral value system or God dictating or whatever you believe there, or consequentialism or virtue ethics or deontology or whatever. If you look at the Phil Papers survey of philosophers around the world, the 2009 one and the 2021, you'll find that philosophers are still broadly split amongst all the moral value systems. Like, no one agrees still. 3,000 years later, no one agrees. Why do they not agree? Because there is actually no answer. There is no. It's like, well, you end up arguing for what you think is the best way to construct a moral value system, but it's still fairly subjective. Even though you'll be using this, hopefully the same kind of rationality as the other people, and you'll have the same kind of understanding of their arguments and these are whatever. So the point is, I'm a moral skeptic. Morality does exist, but it exists in here, and when we agree on it, we kind of write laws or we vote people in to enact laws, etc., etc. I've said this before. It's in the agreement and in the codification of our agreement into moral laws in government, and that's why you need a good functioning democracy, because that's how you get your morality reflected nationally, rather than having a dictatorship like Putin, which is his morality reflected nationally. So it's like a top-down morality rather than a bottom-up democratic morality, and which is why education is so important. Because if you have a population that doesn't understand everything enough, then they might vote in the wrong kind of people to get the wrong kind of moral outcomes. So education is really important for making us aware of how the world works, how society works, how philosophy works, how morality works, what is good to us, that we all agree on it, or we agree as much as we can, and the majority of people, the people that agree the most, will vote in the people who are going to enact what they think is the right moral kind of framework. And that's kind of how society works. So, bottom up. I mean, I wrote a book. Oh goodness, where is it? Right, and sorry for those who really believe in God. You know that I'm a heathen liberal, but my book was Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist: How to Do Knowledge, Meaning, and Morality in a Godless World. This is one of my books from only last year, I think, or 2 years ago. And the reason why it's got a wall on the front cover is because it's all about building from the bottom up. Don't start from the top down. Don't start with, well, this is true, and I'm going to work backwards from that. People do that with holy books and stuff. They start from the top, say, well, this is true, and I'm going to work back, and then I'm going to put that onto society or whatever. Which, no, what is reality from the base? I'm going to go back to the very bricks, the bottom bricks, and I'm going to work up. And that's kind of what I'm talking about with morality in society, is like, let's work up to permeate that morality through society rather than dictate it onto society. I always talk about bottom up rather than top down. Uh, I'm really going off on one here, but so going back to what this guy says, a little whiskey shop, and thanks for this. It's a case of, so what? It's just about practicality and about consequentialism. So the US and Germany will be looking at it and says, what would be the consequences if we allowed Ukraine to use these weapons into Russia? The moral consequences is that, well, if that means that they're going to escalate, get really angry, and it's all going to go Pete Tong, it's all going to go wrong, then that's not good. So we don't want to allow you to do that. So it's not really a kind of like, there's different types of morality going on here, because they might morally intuitively look at that and say, yeah, really, like Schultz and Biden might say to Zelensky, yeah, really, you should be able to be allowed to shoot stuff in Russia. And actually, behind the scenes, they might be saying, do you know what? We don't really care if you do, but we're just saying this in public. But then they say, please don't do that. So it means that Russia just don't quite escalate, or they don't, not that they've got anywhere particularly to escalate apart from nuclear, but it could be that Russia then, they're trying to manipulate Russia into not doing certain things. So they say these right things, and they may even mean these right things. We can give you these weapons, but yeah, don't use them like this. Okay, good. You promise? You sign that contract? Okay. And then they jog on. And so there'll be rationale as to why they're saying that, but it will be practical, and it will be trying to take a really kind of like delicate approach to not upsetting Russia too much. Whereas some people would be like, screw that, just give them whatever you like, and you'll probably still be in the same situation. This was the argument about weapons and red lines at the beginning. Well, don't give them main battle tanks. Don't give them main battle tanks, and you might annoy them. Don't get. We've given them main battle tanks. What have they done? Oh, nothing. Because the only place it got to go is chemical weapons and nuclear warheads. So it's like the Kremlin attack with the drones. Don't. We're going to retaliate to this. Blah blah blah. It's like, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do you aren't already doing? So yeah. Anyway, that's my answer to that. Goodness me, I've already gone on too long. What I might do is just leave this kind of waffle that I've done on these two subjects, release this, and I think I'll return to my Zaporizhia Oblast, Chris Owicki analysis of the counteroffensive to another video. May even have to be tomorrow. So this is today's lot for you. Sorry, it's philosophical. Sorry, not sorry, because hey, you can tell I'm excited. I would talk about this for another 2 hours if I could, but I've got to go to work. Anyway, Tula Pips, take care. Thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate that. Please like, subscribe, share, hit bells, blow whistles, dance a merry jig. I don't care. Have a good time. Take care. Bye.